All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick's on the Power. So today I wanted to make a video about an old school bodybuilder by the name of Harold Poole. Now, Harold Poole is a very interesting bodybuilder for a number of reasons. Number one being the fact that he was the first African-American IFBB Mr. America winner. And that was a big deal back in the day because he won that Mr. America back in 1964. And obviously that was over 50 years ago now, so racism back then was a little bit worse than it is now, probably a lot worse than it is now. And back then, the bodybuilding scene in the 50s and 60s was really pretty much dominated by white winners of these competitions. So Harold Poole was the first guy to kind of break that mold. So that was a very historic moment in bodybuilding history. And another thing that's very historic about Harold Poole is that Harold Poole was the first ever runner-up at the Mr. Olympia competition. Obviously, in 1965, being the first Mr. Olympia ever, he took runner-up to Larry Scott. In 1966, he became runner-up for the second time, again to Larry Scott. And in 1966, he also beat Sergio Oliva, who took third in 66. And then the following year in 1967, he would compete in the Mr. Olympia competition again, being beaten by Sergio Oliva and Chuck Sipes, taking third at the 67 Olympias. So he's the only man to have competed in all three of the first three Mr. Olympias. And bear in mind that at that time, being a two-time runner-up at the Mr. Olympia, that was a new record, especially 2 consecutive years. The next guy that would be runner-up 2 times at the Olympia would be Sergio Oliva, but it wouldn't be 2 consecutive years. It would be in 1970 and also in 1972 because Sergio Oliva was banned from competing at the 1971 Mr. Olympia. So I believe the next person to get 2 consecutive second-place finishes 2 years in a row would be Muhammad Makawe in the 80s during the reign of Lee Haney. So make no mistake about it, Harold Poole was one of the best bodybuilders to come out of the 1960s era of bodybuilding. During that period, winning the title of Mr. America, the title of IFBB Mr. Universe, then in 1971, winning the title of IFBB Mr. USA. So this guy, 3-time runner-up at the Mr. Olympia, and then all 3 of the other biggest titles in bodybuilding, the Universe, the America, the USAs, won all of those as well. And then he would continue competing all the way up until 1982, where he placed 9th at the IFBB World Pro Championships. And then in 2004, he was inducted in the IFBB Hall of Fame. Now, all of those major titles that I mentioned up until that point were titles that Harold Poole won during the prime of his bodybuilding career. But the interesting thing about Harold Poole is that as a teenager, he was arguably one of the best teen bodybuilders of all time. In 1961, placing 4th at the Mr. America at the age of 17. And at that time, the Mr. America was one of the biggest titles in bodybuilding next to the Mr. Universe. Obviously, the Mr. Olympia wouldn't be around for another 5 years. So at the age of 17, placing 4th to some of the best grown man bodybuilders in the sport was very impressive. So at the age of 18, Harold Poole was about 200 pounds on stage and 5'10". He would win 4 titles that year at the age of 18. He would win the Mr. North America, the Mr. Chicago Park District, the Mr. Tri-State, and the Mr. Northern Indiana. And then right before he graduated high school in 1962, he would compete in the Mr. America again as a high schooler, taking 2nd at the Mr. America and winning the Most Muscular Award at the Mr. America. So 3 months after graduating high school would be when he won that Mr. Universe title that I mentioned earlier. So another interesting thing here is that Mr. Universe that he won in 1963, he was 19 years old, and he beat Larry Scott. So Larry Scott was the guy that would beat him at the Olympia and win the first Olympia ever in 1965. But as a teenager, Harold Poole had beaten him. So that was a very interesting thing. And again, goes to speak to how great of a bodybuilder Harold Poole really was for that era. So as I mentioned before, he was the first African-American ever to hold the title of IFBB Mr. America. And when he won that title, he was 20 years old. So by the age of 20, he had already won the Mr. America and the Mr. Universe, as well as 4 other titles before ever even competing in the Mr. Olympia. And I would say as far as his physique goes, the probably most standout body part that he had was probably his arms. I mean, his arm development was insane for that period of time, particularly his biceps. Now, obviously, it would turn out that they would be no match for the arms of Larry Scott, but still, for that period of time, this guy had incredible arms. And unfortunately, Harold Poole passed away back in 2014, about 4 years ago now. So he's no longer with us, and I wanted to make a video kind of dedicated to him. I think I mentioned him briefly way back when I had maybe 20,000 subscribers, but I wanted to make a video going into full detail about his bodybuilding career because he was really an incredible bodybuilder for that era. So please give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.